What you're about to hear will change the way you see children forever. A story so unbelievable yet true that it sent shockwaves across our quiet Arizona community last summer. In the dead of night, little Mason Wright stood before the bedroom wall, his tiny 2-year-old hands pressed against the plaster. Tears streamed down his cherubic face as he stared at the seemingly ordinary surface. His mother Brooke found him like this at 3 a.m., the third night in a row, whimpering one of his few words hurt. While most toddlers couldn't distinguish the sound of the air conditioning from a doorbell, Mason's eyes told a different story. He heard something inside that wall, something desperate, something dying, just the house settling, Connor insisted. But how do you explain a baby who refuses to eat, yet sneaks his crackers to a solid wall, or who spills his sippy cup against the baseboard? Night after night, Mason knew what the adults couldn't hear. A German Shepherd was cemented alive behind that wall. And what this baby did next left our entire town in tears. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The Wright family had moved into the adobe-style ranch house on Saguaro Drive just 3 weeks ago, drawn by the spacious yard and the bargain price of a bank foreclosure. Connor, with his salt and pepper hair despite being only 34, had finally secured the management position at Desert Ridge Construction that would allow them to afford a real home. Brooke, perpetually exhausted from her night shifts at the pediatric ward, had fallen in love with the terracotta tiles and the way the morning light spilled across the kitchen counter. Neither of them had given much thought to the home's previous owner. The bank paperwork mentioned only a Frank Holloway deceased, just another casualty of the housing crisis. They'd assumed little Mason, with his mop of golden curls and eyes the color of the desert sky, had been diagnosed with developmental delays at his 18-month checkup. His vocabulary consisted of just 7 words: Mama Dada, no juice more. Doggy and Herta's pediatrician had suggested they start him in early intervention services once they were settled in their new home. He'll catch up, Brookie would tell concerned relatives. He understands everything we say, he just processes things differently. Martha Stevens from next door had been the first to welcome them, arriving with a casserole dish and the particular brand of nosiness that only a 78-year-old lifelong resident could perfect. Her silver hair was always set in the same tight perm, her floral house dresses ironed to crisp perfection. You folks got yourselves quite the deal on old Frank's place, she'd said, eyes darting to every corner as she stepped inside. Such a shame about him and that beautiful shepherd of his ranger. He called him most gentle creature God ever put on this earth, till Frank went peculiar. When Brooke had asked what happened to them, Martha's weathered face had tightened. Nobody rightly knows. Frank started sending strange letters to the editor about government surveillance. Then one day both him and that dog were gone. Sheriff found Frank's truck abandoned out by Copper Creek. 3 months later, never found Frank or the dog. That was, oh, must be going on 9 months ago. Now that first night, as Mason had screamed inconsolably, pointing at his bedroom wall. Neither parent connected the dots. They couldn't hear what their baby heard: the faint, desperate whimpering of something still alive, trapped within the very bones of their new home. On their 5th night in the new house, Brooke woke to the baby monitor crackling with Mason's distress. The digital clock read 2:17 a.m. as she fumbled for her slippers, the concrete floor beneath her feet despite the lingering heat of the Arizona summer day. Mason, sweetie, what's wrong? She whispered, pushing open his bedroom door. The nightlight cast just enough glow to see her son standing in his dinosaur pajamas, pressed against the far wall, his tiny palms flat against the textured surface. Hurt, he said, not turning to look at her. Hurt. Brooke scooped him up, feeling the dampness of tears on his cheeks. Did you have a bad dream, buddy? His little body was rigid in her arms, his gaze still fixed on the wall. I think he's just adjusting to the new house, Connor said the next morning over coffee, dark circles under his eyes matching hers. Remember how my sister's kid cried for a week when they moved? Brooke nodded, watching Mason push his Cheerios around the bowl without eating, I guess. But this feels different. He keeps going to that same spot on the wall. Connor squeezed her shoulder as he stood to leave for work. He'll be okay. Kids are resilient by the 3rd day of Mason. Refusing to eat, Brooke's nursing instincts overrode her desire to appear calm. She scheduled an emergency appointment with his pediatrician, who found nothing physically wrong. Sometimes toddlers protest changes in their environment by refusing food. Dr. Winters explained, "Try not to make mealtimes a battleground. He'll eat when he's hungry enough." But that evening, Brooke caught Mason doing something peculiar. He'd taken his sippy cup of water and a handful of crackers from his dinner plate and was carefully placing them in the corner of his room, right against the baseboard where the wall met the floor. "What are you doing, baby?" she asked. Mason looked up at her with those solemn blue eyes. "Doggy," he said simply. Patting the wall, a chill ran through Brooke. Despite the heat, Martha's words about Frank's missing German shepherd floated back to her. She knelt beside Mason. "There's a doggy?" Mason nodded emphatically. Doggy hurt, she told herself it was just a toddler's imagination. Perhaps he'd heard Martha mention a dog and created a fantasy friend. But that night after Connor had fallen asleep, Brooke sat in Mason's room watching her son's fitful slumber. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Then she heard it so faint she thought she might have imagined it, a scratching sound, followed by what could have been a whimper coming from inside the wall. "Connor," she shook her husband awake. "Connor, I heard something in Mason's wall." He groaned, covering his eyes with his forearm. "It's an old house, Brookie, probably mice." It didn't sound like mice. It sounded like... I know this sounds crazy, but it sounded like a dog. Connor sat up, rubbing his face. A dog in the wall. That's impossible. The next morning, Connor did a perfunctory inspection of the exterior walls, finding nothing unusual. See no holes, no way for an animal to get in there. But Mason's behavior grew more concerning. He began refusing to leave his room, standing sentinel by the wall for hours. He'd place his ear against it, then look up at Brooke with such distress that it broke her heart when Martha Stevens came by with a pie that afternoon. Brooke hesitantly mentioned Mason's fixation. "He keeps saying there's a hurt dog in his wall." Brooke explained, embarrassed to be voicing something so irrational. Martha's hand trembled as she set down her teacup. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "That poor creature?" "What do you mean?" Martha's eyes darted nervously. "I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but Frank wasn't right in the head. Those last months kept saying his dog was spying on him for the government." She leaned closer, week before he disappeared. "I saw him mixing up concrete in his backyard. Middle of July, hot as blazes, thought he was fixing his patio." She paused, but he was wheeling it into the house instead. Brooke felt the blood drain from her face. "You don't think I don't know what to think?" Martha cut her off. "But that boy of yours, my grandma would have said he's got the knowing. Some souls just do that." Night, while Mason finally slept exhausted from his vigil, Brooke convinced Connor to join her in their son's room. "Just listen," she pleaded. "Just for a few minutes." They sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Connor's impatience growing visibly until there it was again, a feeble scratching, followed by a sound so pitiful it could only be described as a moan. "Jesus Christ," Connor whispered, the color draining from his face. "That's not mice." The next morning, Connor called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. He brought home a stud finder and carefully mapped the wall in Mason's room. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, marking areas with painter's tape the wall. "Readings are inconsistent. This section here." He pointed to the corner Mason favored. "It's much thicker than it should be." While Mason napped his first daytime sleep in days, Brookie searched the house for any clue about its previous owner. In a forgotten corner of the attic, she found a box the cleaners had missed. Inside were notebooks filled with increasingly paranoid writings. "They're using Ranger to monitor my thoughts." One entry read, "I can see it in his eyes. They've implanted something in him. The only way to block the signal is to contain it in concrete. The walls will shield me." Brooke's hands shook as she read the final entry, dated just 2 days before Frank was reported missing. "I've sealed the surveillance device in the north bedroom wall. The concrete will block its transmissions, but it keeps making noise. I can still hear it trying to reach them." She brought the notebooks to Connor, who was now tapping sections of the wall with increasing urgency. Mason had woken and resumed his position, tiny hands pressed against the plaster. "We need to open this wall," Brookie said, showing Connor the journals. "Now." Connor hesitated, his practical nature wearing with the evidence before him. "Breaking into a load-bearing wall could compromise the house's structure. We should call someone." "Who, the police?" and tell them what that our 2-year-old thinks a dog is trapped in our wall. Brooke's voice rose. By the time we convince anyone, it could be too late. If there's even the slimmest chance, Mason looked up at them, his blue eyes wide and pleading. Doggy, he said, patting the wall. Doggy hurt. Connor stared at his son for a long moment, then nodded grimly. I'll get my tools. Connor worked methodically, first drilling a small exploratory hole into the section of wall that had shown the most unusual density on the stud finder. When he withdrew the bit, Mason became agitated, reaching for the hole and trying to peer inside. Let me check first, buddy, Connor said gently. Positioning a flashlight and peering through his sharp intake of breath told Brooke everything. What is it? She asked, holding Mason back as he struggled to approach the wall. There's definitely a hollow space that shouldn't be there, Connor said, his voice tight, and I think I see. Brooke's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God! Connor straightened up, his face set with determination. I'm going to cut into the drywall. Keep Mason back, as Connor worked carefully cutting a square into the wall. With the drywall saw, Mason grew increasingly agitated. He began to whimper in concert with the faint sounds now more clearly emanating from within the wall. Doggy hurt, he repeated over and over, tears streaming down his face. His distress mirrored whatever suffering lay behind the barrier. When Connor finally removed the square of drywall, they were confronted with a layer of concrete. Jesus, he muttered. He really did it. The sick bastard actually cemented something in here. We need to get through it, Brooke insisted, her nurse's training kicking in. If there's any chance the dog is still alive. Connor nodded grimly and retrieved a hammer and chisel from his truck. The work was painstaking. He had to break through the concrete without risking injury to whatever might lie beyond. Mason watched with an intensity unnatural for a 2-year-old, his little body tense with anticipation. After 20 minutes of careful chiseling, a crack appeared in the concrete. A foul odor seeped through, a mixture of waste and decay that made Brookie gag. Yet it was unmistakably the smell of something still living. Call Dr. Thompson, Connor said without looking up, continuing his work. Tell her to come now and bring water room temperature, not cold. Brooke made the call with shaking hands, trying to explain the situation to the veterinarian who had treated their previous dog back in Phoenix. A dog cemented in a wall. For how long? Dr. Thompson's incredulity was clear. Even through the phone, we think possibly months. Brooke replied, watching as Connor carefully widened the hole. Please, Abby, I know how it sounds, but we need you. There was a pause before Dr. Thompson responded. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Have towels ready? And Pedialyte. If you have it, don't give the animal water directly. Yet its system could be too compromised by the time Connor had created an opening large enough to see inside. Mason was beside himself with anxiety. Doggy, doggy, he kept saying, trying to wiggle past his father to see what they found. Defied belief. In a space barely large enough to contain it lay the emaciated form of a German shepherd. Its fur was matted with filth, its body so thin that every rib was visible beneath its dull coat. A small drainage pipe had been cemented into the space, apparently allowing minimal moisture to seep in, just enough to prevent immediate death but nothing more. The dog's eyes were sunken, its breathing shallow and labored. How is it still alive? Brooke whispered, horror and pity wearing in her voice. Doggy, Mason said, his voice suddenly calm. He reached out toward the opening, and to their shock, the dog's tail moved, just a feeble twitch, but unmistakable recognition. Connor worked frantically now, enlarging the hole enough to extract the animal. We need to get him out of there. Can you grab those old towels from the garage? As Brooke hurried to retrieve the towels, Martha Stevens appeared at the front door, apparently drawn by the commotion. Lord have mercy, she gasped when she saw what they discovered. It's Ranger, that's Frank's dog. Dr. Dog Thompson arrived moments later, her medical bag clutched tightly as she rushed into the house. The seasoned veterinarian stopped short at the sight before her, the half-demolished wall, the barely alive German shepherd now partially visible, and the tiny blond boy who stood watching with unnerving intensity. I've been practicing for 20 years, she said, kneeling to examine the dog through the opening. I've never seen anything like this by all rights. This animal should be dead. Can you help him? Brooke asked, clutching Mason to her chest despite his struggles to break free. Doctor Thompson's face was grim. I'll try, but you need to understand the level of starvation and dehydration here. It's beyond severe. Even if we get him out alive, the prognosis is extremely guarded. We have to try. Connor insisted, continuing to carefully chip away concrete. My son and he glanced at Mason, who was watching the proceedings with those uncannily adult eyes. He knew it took another 30 minutes to create an opening large enough to extract the dog. During that time, Doctor prepared a makeshift emergency treatment area in the living room, laying out IV fluids and medications. Easy now, she directed as Connor and Brooke gently lifted the German Shepherd from his prison support. His head and hindquarters, his muscles are likely severely atrophied. The dog ranger, according to Martha, weighed a fraction of what a healthy German Shepherd should. His body was little more than skin stretched over bone, and patches of fur had fallen out where his skin had been in constant contact with the concrete as they laid him on the towels Dr. Thompson had arranged. Mason broke free from Brooke's grasp before anyone could stop him. He was kneeling beside the dog, his small hand gently touching RER's head. "Doggy better," he said with absolute certainty. Dr. Thompson worked quickly, inserting an IV catheter and beginning fluid therapy. "He's severely dehydrated," she explained as she worked. "We need to rehydrate him very carefully. Too fast could be as dangerous as the dehydration itself." While the veterinarian worked, Connor pulled Brooke aside. "We need to call the police," he said quietly. "This is animal cruelty, and if Holloway did this," he glanced toward Mason, lowering his voice further. "If he did this to his dog, who knows what else he might have done before he disappeared?" Brooke nodded, her face pale. "Martha," she called to the neighbor who was hovering anxiously nearby, "could you watch Mason for a moment while we make some calls?" But Mason refused to be separated from Ranger. He sat beside the dog, occasionally stroking his head with a gentleness that belied his age. Most striking of all, the dog's eyes never left the boy's face, as though Mason was the only thing anchoring him to life. "I've never seen anything like it." "Doctor," Thompson murmured to Brooke, "it's almost as if they know each other." Sheriff Jim Callahan arrived an hour later, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the scene at 62. He'd been Saguaro sheriff for over 2 decades and prided himself on having seen it all. But even he seemed taken aback by the sight of the dog being treated in the living room, in the hole in the bedroom wall. "Martha called me about Frank's strange behavior last year. He admitted flipping through a small notebook, said he was acting paranoid, talking about government surveillance, but we had no grounds to do anything. No crime to having strange ideas." He shook his head, gazing at the emaciated form of Ranger. "Never imagined he'd do something like this. Though always seemed to love that dog, used to bring him to the diner every Sunday morning for breakfast." "Will Ranger survive?" Connor asked Dr. Thompson as she monitored the IV drip. The veterinarian's expression was cautious. "The next 48 hours will be critical. He's suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, muscle atrophy, and likely organ damage. The fact that he survived this long is nothing short of miraculous." She glanced at Mason, who remained steadfastly by the dog's side. "If I were a superstitious woman, I'd say that boy has something to do with it," as if sensing they were talking about him. Mason looked up. "Doggy, stay," he said firmly, his small hand resting protectively on Rears's bony shoulder. Brooke and Connor exchanged a look laden with questions neither could answer. How had their son known what connection existed between this suffering animal and their 2-year-old child? And what other secrets might their new home be harboring? The next 72 hours unfolded in a blur of sleepless vigilance. Dr. Thompson made the unprecedented decision to treat Ranger in the right home rather than transport him to her clinic. Fearing the move might prove fatal in his fragile state, she converted the living room into a makeshift veterinary ICU, complete with IV stands, monitoring equipment borrowed from her practice, and a nest of blankets where Ranger lay, barely clinging to life in my professional